Are you overwhelmed by the challenge of personalizing communication for thousands of students? That's where Element 451's AI assistants come in. From nudging prospective students to guiding those already on their journey, AI assistants don't just automate, they write, build, and optimize every step of your digital campaigns. Discover how at element451.com/AI team.
Hit it! That's what I'm talking about. Wait!
Okay, now, from the beginning.
Hit it, boys.
Welcome to Reclaiming Free Speech, Democracy, and Discourse on Campus, a podcast about the post-2024 election America look. I'm Dr. Cody Nielsen, Assistant Professor of Higher Education at Western Michigan University and Executive Director of Convergence Strategies. No matter the outcome, the 2024 election will set the stage for the next decade of higher education. In this Pulse Check series, I'll interview policymakers and practitioners to discuss their outlook on higher education, the ways in which we might reestablish higher education's public trust, and what a post-2024 election will look like on college campuses. From expression of speech to civil democracy and discourse, America's higher education system is at a dramatic turning point, and we're here to break it all down. Let's dive into today's episode. Today's guest is Dr. Peter Levine. Dr. Levine serves as Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and Lincoln Feline Professor of Citizenship and Public Affairs at the Tisch College at Tufts University. The author of 8 books, including What Should We Do? A Theory of Civic Life, and his most recent book, We Are the Ones We Have Been Waiting For, The Promise of Civic Renewal in America, Dr. Levine is a nationally known voice in civic democracy spaces across the United States. Peter, welcome to the broadcast today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Peter, I'm really excited to have you as a part of this, as the third episode guest on this series. And we're coming to you only 2 days after the election, not even 48 hours after the election of Donald Trump as the 47th president, only the second president ever to receive a second term. And for some folks, somewhat of a surprise, and others not so much. As we talk today, we're definitely going to talk about what this means for higher education and civic democracy in America. But as we get started, I want to just ask you to tell us a little of your story. You've been at Tufts University for a while now, but what would you say has changed since your time of when you started as an educator in the 80s and 90s from the content and the curriculum that you're offering students?
The world's changed, obviously, in important ways. One way that the students talk about a lot is social media, which they don't like at all. I mean, I can't really get even much of a debate about it in my classes. I have 50 students this fall. I mean, they're mostly very harshly critical of it. So that's kind of, even autobiographically, that's kind of interesting to me because I'm in the generation that came of age as the internet was launching. And there was a lot of enthusiasm, maybe some hype, but a lot of enthusiasm, a sense that this was empowering, basically, and that we might finally have an open public sphere. And now the students really see almost completely negative at almost every level, from the interpersonal or the even spiritual level to the political. I'm actually sometimes not as pessimistic as they are because I feel like there's opportunity for it to change. So there's the way the world's changed. I think there's this kind of sea change in our diagnosis. I mean, a lot of people were really worried in the 90s about a decline in what we used to call we still call civil society interest involvement in grassroots groups and things. And now there's a lot of energetic action, although there's still, I should say, going back to the earlier conversation, there's still a lot of people left out, and we still have to work on that. The turnout will be decently high this year, but of course, a lot of people didn't vote. The issues now have often to do with things like hyper-partisanship or false information or different kinds of radicalization, and so that's a different agenda. But we also study those in class. I mean, these are topics of research and investigation. So if you're a solid student and you're trying to get a take on these things, you can read books about polarization or media or whatever. And that's what we do.
Obviously, we're now sort of looking at and we're seeing like the results of this year's election. And, the fact is, at the moment, we know that the US Senate will be led by the Republican Party. We obviously know that Donald Trump will be in the White House again. We don't yet know the outcome of the US House, though it is teetering very close to the Republican Party gaining control, and is very likely, I would say more than 90% at this point, likely that the Republican Party will have control of all three branches of government. From a civic education and a civic democracy space, like, what's the lesson that you would take from this that you would now insert right into the classroom for your students about the Harris campaign's maybe failure to address working class voters, which has become the sort of rhetoric over the last 48 hours, but also just in terms of broad-based civic democracy and civic education? What's the lesson for us now?
Yeah, so I guess I get a little resistant to assessing the quality of civic education in terms of the voting outcome, because people do have a right to vote the way they want to vote. One of my dear colleagues and friends texted me in the morning and said, based on the Trump election, we got to look again at civic education. Actually, part of my life and daily work is K-12 civic education, but so I've been trying to, a big part of it, and I've been trying to work on it for years. But also, I don't agree with that framing, because that the implication there is if we did the civic education differently, people would have voted differently, and I think that's a dangerous path to go down. Anybody can play that. In terms of curriculum, we don't know what's going to happen now, but we could be in a period of real political instability and constitutional rupture and change. We could have mass mobilization also in resistance to a Trump administration. From a curricular perspective, people need to learn about these things. We have the oldest written constitution in the world, so we do have a implicit curriculum that says, this constitution that you're studying in 8th grade will always be with you for the rest of your life, and we'll always have elections and stuff. But that's a unique situation, literally, in the whole world. And the kind of vocabulary that most people learn when they learn about politics is things like instability, regime change. It could be very, very bad. I'm not saying we want this a change, although it doesn't have to be very, very bad. Anyway, people need to learn how to think about these things. I also just would make a pitch that people need to learn about nonviolence, because there's a lot to learn about nonviolence. It has great depths. There's a lot of, it's not just deciding not to be violent. It's got a lot of depths in terms of its strategy. And in a context of instability, I believe the only way to have positive change is actually nonviolent. And although I wouldn't preach to young people that they need to use the nonviolent methods, I definitely want them to know how to do it.
Just forecasting a little bit. You've been on a college campus for a long time. You have a few decades of wisdom and have seen the sort of turning tides. What do you think we're going to see on college campuses now? What do you think we're going to see in the classroom moving forward? What do you think that we might see, like, within the systems of higher education, like in the next 12 to 18 months?
Well, I sincerely don't really have wisdom, and the more the years go by, and the more surprising the political events are, the less I think I have wisdom. But I guess I'll try to answer your question with a few sort of thoughts that are based in a little bit of evidence. One thing is there's really a strong pattern that the population reacts negatively to the ideology of the existing president, just over and over again. So the population got more conservative when Obama was president and Biden was president, but this goes back 30 years, 40 years maybe, and they got more liberal when Bush was president and when Trump was president. So I would imagine that you'll see a lot of the median shift left on among young people. Although the other very interesting thing that's a little different is we had by far the closest split between Democrats and Republicans among young people, between the Democratic and Republican candidate that we've had, since 2000. So Trump did pretty well. He did much better than Biden. I haven't memorized the numbers, but I have seen them, and it's much better. And he did particularly well among young white men. So that also means that some college campuses will be places where there's quite varied responses to what happens as if there's controversy. Of course, it depends on the college campus. So our campus just happens to have hardly any actual Trump supporters. We have conservatives, but they tend to be anti-Trump. And so, but there are going to be plenty of campuses where it's 50-50 or even more pro-Trump. And so you'll have a different dynamic. And if there's a lot of mobilization and counter-mobilization, I think you could have very serious conflict And, one thing that didn't happen in the previous Trump 4 years, is that at least federal law enforcement didn't deliberately kill protesters. But that's one of the things that happens in politics in the world. So we could see a different level. I don't know that we will, but we could see a different level of conflict.
So with that potential, and obviously there's always potential when we have conflict at political environments, what kind of wisdom would you have for our audience, which is going to be largely higher ed administrators and other faculty like yourself? Like, what do we need to be doing to equip ourselves from a civic democracy and sort of civic education space, like right now?
At the institutional level, there's discussion about whether institutions should express neutrality or take neutrality positions. I mean, my own view on that is that it actually has been problematic for institutions to just make statements about current events as institutions. That notion that they are adding anything by just making a statement is questionable to me. That we need to find out what Tufts University thinks about Israel-Palestine, I find implausible. And there is a risk that by having the university say things about any old topic, that you're possibly squelching dissent within the university. So I'd be in favor of them not doing as much of that. But on the other hand, I definitely don't think we're neutral. I think we're committed to all kinds of things. I mean, Tufts, for example, has got all kinds of programs that may not be good enough, but there are a lot of them that are about combating climate change. And the president-elect doesn't believe in climate change and thinks it's a hoax. So we're not neutral. So I would make sure that we don't silence ourselves, but that our addition to the public square is substantive and meaningful. So for Tufts to come out and say, climate change is real, that's of no use, because people have been saying that already. For Tufts to come out and say, we are making this investment in this kind of research on climate change for this reason, that's meaningful. That goes back to Black Lives Matter and other things. The statements often were performative, and they didn't. So I would be in favor of a statement that basically says Black Lives Matter, but it needs to say, and therefore we are doing the following things, hiring these people or whatever. It's just saying it. We need to stop. That's only one piece to answer your question. I think two other quick things, much shorter. There is a zone for just sort of listening across difference and bridging differences. I don't think everybody has to do that all the time, and it's not everybody's burden, but I do think there's a space for that. And then there's also a space for learning to be more effective, nonviolent activists. And that's partly a set of tools that students can learn.
You and I came across each other about a little more than a year ago through a colleague of mine who also works at Tufts University, and she had directed me to you and your Frontiers of Democracy conference, which is now a longstanding or a relatively longstanding conference that you have held each June. What do you expect to happen with the nature of that conference, and what do you see yourself sort of as your next as a scholar practitioner and activist in this space moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, the conference was always it's about 12 or 14 years old. It is pretty old. It's always supposed to be sort of exploring the different frontiers of democracy, so different kinds of work. But to be honest, it is typically drawn a kind of deliberative democracy sort of person, particularly. So a person who thinks that dialogue and deliberation in communities is valuable, which I also think. I do believe in that. That also may be relevant in a period of conflict. I did, the K-12 work came up, and I guess you and I haven't really talked about that before, but that is a big part of my life, because for 10 years I ran this institute called Circle, which is mostly focused on that, and I'm still part of it. And what we've been trying to do is hold together, try to have it not fracture into a blue and a red civics, because if that happens, I worry. I mean, partly as somebody who is left of center, I worry that then there's no impact of any left of center ideas on people in red states. I want to hold this together, and I'm willing to compromise to get that. So I'm willing to listen to people from red states, and we've had some success with that. I don't know if we can hold it together in the face of the Trump. To put it one way, the Trump administration funded this thing called the Educating for American Democracy Roadmap that I was part of, and then the Biden administration continued its funding. But I don't know if we could get that kind of support from another Trump administration. I think that was the kind of thing that went through in the first Trump, and I don't know if it would go through in the second. So you could see it fracturing, and I think kids would be worse off. I know that some lefty friends of mine would be suspicious of our even efforts to try to bridge the gap, but I think if we don't do that, we're just writing off the opportunity for half or more than half of our young people to get a balanced curriculum.
It is interesting that you say that, because going back to the first guest on this podcast, Desiree Anderson, like from a sort of restorative lens, one of the big things that we were sort of talking about is the need for us to slow down and have some really serious conversations about how do we get people together into conversations, and that sort of that ability for us. I mean, let me just sort of pull Alinsky for a minute, but to go back to sort of organizing spaces where Alinsky's level of sort of like disbursement of that which you disagreed with and you just sort of like flushed your way through, but maybe in comparison to a more modernized, I wouldn't say, like the newest form, but like the Marshall Gann sort of story of self, story of, us, and story of now, sort of like pedagogy in terms of like, we have to be able to build a collective and not leave people out of the conversation.
Yeah. Alinsky, for those who don't know, the late Alinsky, I mean, I think that divisive aspect of Alinsky grew in him and it was more stronger at the end, but he has these actual rules in the Rules for Radicals book, which are things like find the issue that divides and that where you can win. And some people think that that is a kind of toolkit that is very prevalent, not only on the right, but also on the left, and that it's self-defeating and does collateral damage even if you happen to win. But there's counter arguments. I will say in the education space, we in the civic education space, this thing called the Educating for American Democracy Roadmap that the Trump administration funded, we pulled together 300 people who were ideologically and otherwise diverse. We spent a couple of years and we came up with this consensus roadmap about what students should learn. And it's possible to, obviously, it's more than possible. It's fine to criticize it ideologically or otherwise, but I think we found a lot of consensus. If students got this roadmap, they would get a lot more intense study of race and racism and white supremacy in their schools than they are getting now. And that's with the support of the conservatives. But I'm talking about responsible, serious conservatives. So I believe that it's possible to reach common ground. Though I don't know if it's possible to reach common ground with everybody all the time.
Maybe that's the line. There's a need for us to find the people that we can engage in discursive conversations with and reach the common ground, that it's okay for us to disagree. Maybe it's the people that won't sit at the table win the disagreement that we can't engage yet. Like, I think from a restorative lens, I find that all the time. You have to find the people that are willing to sit in the room and experience the harm and actually be willing to talk through the healing process.
John Powell says we need to build bridges to everybody, but doesn't mean we have to start by building the hardest, longest bridge first.
That's true. And the work of John Powell and others are definitely have been speaking vocally about that. I actually heard a talk about that not 2 days ago. So
great.
This is going to be a long-standing conversation. We're going to see a lot of folks over the next few months, like sort of have this conversation. They're going to be trying to find their grounding and where they go from here. And I just have to ask, like, what are you doing to take care of yourself? What wisdom do you have for the audience? And what wisdom are you sort of telling yourself now? You are, as you say, left of center, and so am I. And what are you doing to take care of yourself now that we know the results and know in some ways what's beginning to come, if not fully what's coming in this next 4 years?
Well, thanks for asking. And I think this checking in with each other is one of the things we should do. And so I hope that you're doing okay. I do also think people are in different places in the society and have different roles and responsibilities. I mean, I'm very sad and angry and it feels like a tragedy has happened. But I will say I also have tenure at a private university, which is pretty insulated from political pressures. I'm a middle-aged white man. I got to sort of suck it up and stand up. I can feel sad for a little bit, but I got to get going. I'm not saying that's true for everybody. I think that's true for me. Honestly, one of my feelings is being very tired because in the first Trump administration, I worked pretty hard. I don't know if I was effective, but I worked pretty hard. I traveled a lot. I did a lot of stuff. And I feel like, I have to do this again. And this will be basically heading into my 60s. I'm going to be doing this again when I was doing it in my 50s. And I feel really tired, but it's just too bad for someone like me. I got to just do it. It's not no excuses. I mean, if you look at the world as a whole and think about how many people have been in worse political situations and I'm in Massachusetts. I mean, I just got to suck it up and do it. But I'm saying that about me and maybe anybody who identifies with me as feeling similar to me, but I'm not saying that to everybody. There are some people who have to keep their heads down. And there are some people who just need to heal and stuff. But I don't want to hear excuses. And from my kind of class and this stuff about like I'm going to go to Canada or something. No, that's cowardly. This is the moment when you stand up.
I appreciate that because it centers your positionality, and both of us as white men hold a lot of privilege. And I think that I feel very similar. Like, I'm really upset. I'm going to stay in my grief and I'm going to sit with that for a while. And at some point, you just got to get back up and you got to figure out how I think for us, you and me, how at times we're going to have to go, dare I say, and I hate to put this in a sort of like militaristic perspective, but be willing to go to the front lines.
Yeah.
Because there are folks who are in real harm's way that, yes, won't be able to keep their heads above, the shoulder line and need to keep a lookout. Yeah. And for those of us that have the privilege that we're not going to be harmed, we just got to go for it.
Yeah. You also can get satisfaction, and I think one should be willing to take satisfaction from being successfully involved in some resistance, right? I don't think we should all be so fundamentally sad and angry that we can't take pleasure. I remember even at the very beginning of the Trump administration, there was a huge protest at the Delta Air Terminal, or Terminal E at Logan, against the so-called Muslim ban. I was moved and appreciated it. There were an enormous number of people showed up at Logan Airport on a weekend evening. And if we can't, and I didn't help to organize that. If I'd helped to organize it, I would have been even more proud and would have had rightly a feeling of success. So you got to be willing to take your wins and take some pleasure and even joy in the moments when things go well, or when you just have a chance to contribute. So it's also a privilege to be able to just contribute. I get to talk to students and others in ways that I hope are helpful to them. And so that's a great blessing to have that opportunity.
I appreciate that very much. Peter, I am just so indebted and thankful that you were willing to join me on the podcast today. I think what we're talking about and what we'll be echoing for a long time for our listeners is just, starting to think about what it means for us. And I think this conversation around civic democracy and civic education is just so timely and so important. So I want to thank you for taking the time to join me today. If you want to find out more about the Frontiers of Democracy Conference, check out the website at Tisch College. There'll be more information, I'm sure, in the coming months. The conference takes place every year in June, and I know that there's some new ideas and new percolating happening around that. So we'll all be excited. So Peter, again, thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
The Higher Ed Pulse is part of the Enrollify podcast network. If you like this podcast, chances are you'll like other Enrollify shows too. Our podcast network is growing by the month, and we've got a plethora of marketing, enrollment, and higher ed technology shows that are jam-packed with stories, ideas, and frameworks, all designed to empower you to be a better higher ed professional. Our show helps higher ed marketers and admission pros find their next big idea and features a selection of the industry's best as your hosts. Learn from Brian Gross, Eddie Francis, Jenny Lee Fowler, and so many of your favorite leaders in higher ed. Enrollify is made possible by Element 451, the next generation AI student engagement platform, helping institutions create meaningful and personalized interactions with students. Learn more at element451.com.